All right, hi everyone. Phil Travis here, and this week's lesson is on the U.S. war in Iraq and terrorism. So I hope this is helpful. Let's have a great week.
So, the Bush administration's war in Iraq and also Afghanistan, of course, the Afghanistan operation known as Operation Enduring Freedom, and of course the Iraq war was initially known as Operation Iraqi Freedom. These really began after the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, even though the invasion of Iraq doesn't occur until 2003. Um, the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001 created the initiative for the Bush Doctrine, as it's called. And the Bush Doctrine really is a unilateral um, global strategy principle, meaning that the Bush Doctrine reserved the right of the United States, with or without the support of the international community, to take unilateral action against nations that it deemed to be either a direct threat or a potential future threat. And of course, this generally involved the offering of ultimatums to foreign leaders. Afghanistan, the Taliban was given an ultimatum to turn over bin Laden. And of course, the threat of force was the recourse for their refusal to do that. And of course, the Bush administration also placed an ultimatum on Saddam Hussein to leave the country before the invasion of Iraq. And so the Bush Doctrine amounted to the assertion of an ultimatum, a threat to a particular leadership, and the use of preemptive and or unilateral military force against that particular state and government. Preemption means taking a military assault against a country before they've actually committed an act against you. Of course, the case of Iraq, the Saddam Hussein administration may not have been a great leadership, but of course, Saddam Hussein in Iraq was well known, was not involved in the terror attacks of September 11th. It was a leadership that had not been deeply involved with the forces of terrorism either, but the Bush administration deemed it to be a potential future threat in the region, and from that ground used a large-scale conventional preemptive use of force against the Saddam Hussein regime. So the Bush Doctrine is, in some respects, a break from the past, meaning that we will reserve the right to use large, preemptive, and unilateral force, not necessarily an agreed international force, against countries that have not directly attacked the United States. That was the principle behind both the attack in Iraq and, of course, the war in Afghanistan. The Bush Doctrine was really the construction of neoconservatives who believed that, particularly with Iraq, who believed that if the U.S. could encourage revolutions in the Middle East, that these revolutions would ultimately, if the United States was complicit in creating them, would create a groundswell of American-centric nations throughout the Middle East. This was the kind of idea behind the Bush Doctrine in Iraq. The invasion of Iraq, of course, occurred in 2003, and it was masterminded really most by Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. Rumsfeld had insisted that the United States would use a very limited, small, relatively small invasion force of 122,000 armed forces going into Iraq. This was a refutation of the encouragement of specialists in the administration, Middle Eastern specialists, that insisted that the United States needed a force of at least 270,000. Rumsfeld didn't want to do that. They wanted to kind of do this short, quick, and relatively on the cheap. And Rumsfeld believed that our technological superiority over the Iraqi military would be the advantage that would make us successful. In a way, it was similar to how we escalated in Vietnam, as McNamara and the planners around the Vietnam War were very much misguided by the huge technological and economic advantages possessed by the United States. Of course, the direct reason when Colin Powell, the Secretary of State at the time, went before the United Nations in 2001 demanding that the United Nations support the U.S. operation against Iraq in 2002 and 2003, the assertion was that Iraq possessed a weapons of mass destruction program, and that this weapons of mass destruction program was a threat because it potentially could fall into or be given to terrorist forces. George W. Bush famously referred to Saddam Hussein's Iraq as part of an axis of evil, in which he included the other countries that were, like Afghanistan, that were viewed as enemies of the United States, but also terrorist enemies throughout the globe. And so the justification was that the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, and that these weapons of mass destruction might fall into the hands of terrorists and be used against the United States. Of course, in hindsight, there was a lot of misjudgment on the part of the Bush administration's leadership and a lot of failures of intelligence. Saddam Hussein, the sanctions that had been in place since the Persian Gulf War in 1991, Saddam Hussein's regime had really been crippled largely economically and militarily, and there was really no weapons of mass destruction program to speak of. Certainly not one that was an impending threat. In addition, Saddam Hussein, just by the way, Saddam Hussein was not ever he was not a kind of Islamic religious kind of leader. Saddam Hussein was a secular leader in the Middle East, and actually he was not close friends with jihadist movements. But nonetheless, we were misguided in terms of the scale of, we being the United States, the scale, if any, of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction program. In addition, there was complete misjudgment of the Iraqi resistance and of the difficulties of nation building in Iraq. There was an accepted notion presented by individuals like Dick Cheney, who's pictured here center, that the United States would be accepted as liberators, and that the actual end game of rebuilding and reconstructing Iraq would be relatively easily. And of course, that was a huge error, and the reality could not have been further from the truth. Of course, in 2004, George Bush famously, or infamously really, George Bush rather infamously, because the worst part of the war was to come. In 2004, aboard an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf, George Bush declared mission accomplished, the end of combat operations in Iraq. In reality, it was a statement more similar to Neville Chamberlain's declaration of peace in our time at the beginning of World War II, after the Munich crisis, or the Munich conference. Mission was not accomplished, obviously. The war in Iraq descended into sectarian violence. The worst and harshest fighting was yet to come, particularly the two operations in Fallujah, which were some of the most devastating for Iraqi civilians and American soldiers. The worst part of the war was yet to come. The United States had made some significant failures in the early period of the war. We had disbanded the Ba'athist Party, which was Saddam Hussein's political party. It was something that seemed like a no-brainer at the time, but the Ba'athist Party was the only group that really had great experience in leadership in the government. And so the Ba'athist Party offered a political structure. Well, disbanding the Ba'athist Party meant that you basically had to start from scratch, and that you'd start from scratch amid increasing sectarian tensions. They also disbanded the Iraqi military, which again was also seemed like a no-brainer that you would disband this military because this military was associated with Saddam Hussein and his Ba'athist party and was associated with being used in some cases against the people of Iraq. However, disbanding the military, disbanding Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist party were really quite devastating failures because they undermined formal institutions in the country and led the United States to have to create from scratch these institutions amid increasing sectarian violence among Sunnis and Shias. One of the great problems with the American war during this period was that the Sunni element, Sunni Islam in Iraq, the Sunnis, the Ba'athist party, were Sunni. They were a minority in the country. The Shia were the majority. Well, the Sunni had been ruling in Iraq for decades, and the United States effectively, through their partners on the ground, ultimately alienated the Sunni. And many Sunnis rallied behind Sunni Islamic leaders and became what they described as jihadists in fighting the American and the American-backed Shia government, the al-Maliki government, ultimately. The result is the development of an increasing sectarian tension in the country, and today this remains as the Islamic State is evidence of these failures of the United States operations in Iraq. The Islamic State is largely a Sunni jihadist militant group, and its support really comes from wide sectors of the Iraqi military and the Iraqi populace that was disenfranchised, basically, or cut out of the new government that was created in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq. And so this division that was created fundamentally at the beginning of the Iraq War, this encouragement inadvertently by the United States for sectarian violence among Sunni and Shia has really created the Sunni jihadist movements in Iraq that Americans fought first in Fallujah, and now that the American-backed ally in Iraq faces with the insurgent IS or ISIL or ISIS, the Islamic State movement. The Obama administration has, of course, just a last note here, the Obama administration, of course, has really continued the war on terror. Granted, they called it something different, but they've continued the war on terror, and in some respects, in some aspects, U.S. involvement internationally in fighting the war on terrorism has gone up, and in other respects, perhaps it has gone down. Barack Obama, your book compares his policy as more like Eisenhower's policy. And what the author means by that is that Barack Obama is attempting to wage the war on terror vigilantly, but trying to do so with less reliance on large-scale, conventional, very costly style operations. And so Barack Obama, the Obama administration, tends to rely on air power. Of course, we've seen that in trying to combat the Islamic State. Support for insurgents, we've seen that with, of course, support for those fighting the Assad regime in Syria. And of course, we know that provided mixed results, as undoubtedly some of the support for insurgents that were helping us, undoubtedly some of that support ultimately went to those individuals who were forming the Islamic State movement. The use of drones, the Obama administration has used, for example, Predator drones at a much higher level than the Bush administration in places like border areas around Afghanistan and Pakistan, and in places like Yemen. The use of drones has become a commonplace and a new issue for Americans to consider when it comes to waging the war on terror. Of course, also, the Obama administration has relied on military advisors in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. We have really ended conventional war of direct American forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, but we remain there as in advisory capacity. And of course, we've increased our advisors in Iraq fighting ISIS, and it seems quite possible that in the future we might see American boots on the ground fighting ISIS in Iraq if the U.S. supported Iraqi military is unable to stop ISIS. And of course, right now we have major operations going on in places like Tikrit, which of course was Saddam Hussein's hometown and is one of the strongholds close to Baghdad held by IS militants. I'd also note that the war in Iraq has really, the war in Iraq is part of a new global war on terrorism. And the war in Iraq is part and parcel to really an expanded status of irregular war throughout the globe, whether in Afghanistan, whether in Pakistan, whether in Yemen, whether in North Africa, places like, of course, Libya. There are irregular, or of course you hear about Boko Haram in Nigeria, and of course Mali had a huge Al-Qaeda uprising a few years ago. Terrorism as a problem since the beginning of the war on terror has not slowed down. In fact, it's increased. And critics of the Bush administration's policies when the war in Iraq began in 2003, critics of these policies insisted that these policies were going to create more terrorists and that it was going to create greater problems in the world. And it appears that, to at least some degree, those individuals were correct. Today, the terrorist problem is more widespread and more destructive in more areas than was ever imagined before, as it is seen quite intensely in parts of the Middle East, in parts of Central Asia, in parts of Africa, North Africa. It is a very significant problem, and the usage of military force has been unable to solve that problem. Of course, the war on terrorism as this global irregular war, a war that, in which militants gain recruits over the internet, in which people travel throughout the globe, for example, in some cases to fight with ISIS in the Middle East. The war on terrorism also has bled over to some cases in domestic societies in the Western world. And for this reason, it's come hand in hand with a marginalization of certain civil liberties in the United States. Of course, the United States today, we know all about the NSA operations. Americans today are under a closer surveillance by their leadership than at any other point in the country's history. And of course, certain amendment rights, whether it is the Fifth Amendment, your right to habeas corpus, or your Fourth Amendment rights to be free from illegal searches and seizures, these types of things, or your right to privacy, which is interpreted throughout elements of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. These rights by the USA Patriot Act, which has been renewed several times since it was created by the Bush administration following the 2001 terrorist attacks, certain key American rights and freedoms have come under attack as a result of this global irregular war that the United States is engaged in. It's a global irregular war because it's a war that does not have clear boundaries. It doesn't have clear boundaries in terms of states that are involved. It's generally non-state actors. Generally, you're talking about groups that operate within a variant of countries. They operate across the borders of countries, and they recruit people via mass media, particularly the internet. And so it's a new kind of war, and it's one that we have yet to really get a handle on how to succeed at. Anyway, guys, let's have a great week. Last week, week 10, I hope this stuff is helpful, and it's been a great term. So I hope you guys have also gotten something out of the term. All right, thanks.